The iron gates of Ravenworth Hall stood exactly as Margaret Ashford remembered them, towering, cold, unyielding monuments to a life that had cast her out like refuse 5 years ago. Snow fell softly over the manicured grounds, covering the harsh edges of memory with deceptive gentleness, making everything look peaceful when peace was the last thing Meg had known within these walls. She stood motionless on the December afternoon of 1847, her worn cloak pulled tight against the bitter wind, and she felt the small hand in hers squeeze with nervous energy. "Mama!" The voice was so quiet, so uncertain. "Is this the big house you told me about?" Meg looked down at her daughter and felt her heart constrict with love so fierce it bordered on pain. Thea was 5 years old as of last month, though she seemed older in the way children do when they've learned too young that the world requires careful navigation. Dark hair fell in waves around a face that was achingly, impossibly familiar. The same strong chin, the same grey eyes, the same serious expression that transformed into startling beauty when she smiled. She was William Thornfield in miniature, and there would be no denying her parentage once anyone with eyes looked at her properly. "Yes, my love," Meg managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is Ravenworth Hall." "It's very grand," Thea observed with the frank assessment of childhood. "Do you think they'll be nice to us?" The question cut deeper than any blade could have managed. Meg knelt in the snow, heedless of the dampness seeping through her already threadbare skirt, and took both of Thea's small hands in. "Listen to me carefully. Some of the people inside may not be kind at first. They may say things that are confusing or hurtful, but I need you to remember something very important. You have done nothing wrong. You are precious and loved and worthy, no matter what anyone says or how they look at us. Do you understand?" Thea nodded with that heartbreaking solemnity that made her seem far older than 5. "Will my papa be there?" Meg's throat tightened. She had told Thea about William in the careful, edited way one tells children difficult truths, that her father was a duke who lived far away, that circumstances had separated them, that he had never known about Thea's existence. She had not told her daughter about the forged letter, about the cold cruelty of the man who had orchestrated their exile, about the nights Meg had wept herself to sleep in that draughty cottage in the Scottish Highlands, while her pregnancy advanced and winter closed in around her isolation. "Yes," Meg said quietly, "your papa will be there. But Thea, he doesn't know about you yet. That's why we've come, so he can finally meet you and know the truth about what happened. Will he be happy to see me?" The question was asked with such vulnerable hope that Meg had to blink back tears. "I believe he will be," Meg said, praying desperately that she was right, that 5 years hadn't changed William so completely that he would reject the daughter whose existence he'd been kept ignorant of through deliberate cruelty. "Now come, we need to be brave together." She stood, smoothing Thea's coat, a cast-off from a merchant's daughter in Edinburgh, too large but serviceable, and straightened her own shoulders with determination, born of 5 years surviving alone. Music drifted from the glowing windows of Ravenworth Hall, the sounds of celebration and warmth that seemed to mock the cold poverty of Meg's exile. The annual Christmas dinner she knew from her sister Eleanor's carefully worded letters, when half of England's aristocracy gathered to celebrate the season under the Duke of Ravenworth's hospitality. It was perfect, witnesses everywhere, no way to silence her or dismiss her claims as the ravings of a discarded wife, no opportunity for Lord Henry Thornfield, William's father and the architect of her destruction, to orchestrate another convenient disappearance. Meg had chosen this night deliberately, just as 5 years ago Lord Henry had chosen the method of her expulsion with calculated precision. She had learned from her enemy. Now she would use his own tactics against him. "Are you ready?" she asked Thea, her voice gentle, despite the storm of emotions churning inside her. Thea nodded and slipped her hand back into Meg's with trust that made Meg's heart ache. Together they pushed open the gate, and the iron groaned in protest as if the house itself was awakening to the reckoning about to unfold. There was no turning back now, only the truth she had travelled 500 miles to deliver, and the courage she had built piece by painful piece during 5 years of exile, poverty and survival. The side entrance of Ravenworth Hall stood unguarded, just as Meg had hoped. Servants too busy with the Christmas dinner preparations to notice 2 shabby figures slipping through the tradesman's door. She had lived here for 2 years as William's wife, had learned every hallway and hidden passage during the brief happiness of their marriage, before Lord Henry had systematically destroyed everything. Thea walked close beside her, eyes wide as she took in the grandeur that Meg had long since stopped noticing. The marble floors, the gilt-framed portraits of stern Thornfield ancestors, the crystal chandeliers that cast prismatic light across walls panelled in rich mahogany. This had been Meg's home once, before it became her prison, and then her exile. They moved through the servants' corridor, and Meg's heart pounded as familiar voices drifted from the kitchen. Mrs. Carson, the cook, Mr. Davies, the head footman, and, her breath caught, Mr. Winters, the butler who had stood silent and complicit while Lord Henry had presented her with that forged letter and ordered her from the house like a dismissed servant. "Stay close," Meg whispered to Thea, pulling her daughter into a small alcove as footsteps approached. A young maid hurried past carrying linens. 2 rushed to notice the shadows that didn't belong. When the corridor emptied again, Meg led Thea toward the main hall, following the sound of conversation and laughter that grew louder with each step. "Mama, I'm frightened," Thea whispered. Meg stopped and knelt again, framing her daughter's face with hands that trembled despite her determination. "I know, my darling, I'm frightened too, but sometimes we must be brave, even when we're scared, especially when we're seeking justice and truth. Like in the stories you tell me, about knights and quests?" "Exactly like that," Meg said, managing a smile. "We're on a quest for truth, and you, my sweet girl, are the proof that truth always finds its way to light eventually." Footsteps sounded behind them, deliberate, familiar, and Meg spun to find a woman in elegant grey silk standing in the corridor, with one hand pressed to her mouth in shock. "Meg!" Eleanor Ashford breathed, eyes wide with disbelief and dawning joy. "Oh my God, you came! You actually came!" "Ellie!" Meg whispered, and then her sister was rushing forward, pulling her into an embrace so fierce it drove the breath from her lungs. "I didn't think you'd do it," Eleanor said against Meg's hair, voice thick with tears. "When I sent that letter telling you about the Christmas dinner, I thought perhaps it was too much to ask, that you'd never risk coming back here after what he did to you." "I had to," Meg interrupted quietly, "for Thea. She deserves to know her father, and William deserves to know the truth." Eleanor pulled back, and for the first time seemed to register the small figure half hidden behind Meg's skirts. Her expression transformed from shock to wonder as she knelt to Thea's level. "Thea," Meg said softly, "Thea, this is your Aunt Eleanor, my sister." Thea emerged slowly from behind Meg, studying Eleanor with careful assessment. "You look like Mama," she observed. Eleanor laughed, a sound caught between joy and tears. "And you look exactly like—" She stopped, glancing up at Meg with eyes that held both understanding and concern. "The resemblance is unmistakable, Meg. Anyone who looks at her will know immediately whose child she is." "I'm counting on it," Meg replied. 5 years ago, Lord Henry cussed me out with a forged letter and lied about William's wishes. Tonight, in front of half of England's aristocracy, he's going to face the truth he tried to bury, that he separated a husband from his wife and a father from his daughter. Eleanor straightened slowly, her expression hardening with determination. "Then we'll do this properly. The dinner is about to be served. If you wait in the library, I can create a disturbance that will bring everyone to witness." "No," Meg interrupted firmly. "I won't hide in the shadows anymore. I'm going to walk into that dining room and I'm going to look William in the eyes, and he's going to see what his father stole from us both. It's going to cause a scandal, Eleanor warned, the kind that will be discussed in every drawing room in London for months. Good, Meg said flatly. Let them talk. I've spent 5 years in exile while Lord Henry shaped the narrative to his satisfaction. Tonight, the truth gets told, and witnesses ensure it cannot be buried again. Eleanor studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You've changed, Meg. You're harder than you were. I've had to be, Meg replied. Survival required it. Then let's finish what we've started. Eleanor held out her hand. I'll stay with you, both of you. Whatever happens in that dining room, you won't face it alone. Meg took her sister's hand, feeling the solid warmth of solidarity she hadn't known in 5 years of isolation. Thank you, Ellie, for your letters, for finding me in Scotland, for giving me the courage to come back. You were always brave, Eleanor corrected gently. You just forgot for a while. Now come. They're seating for dinner. Together they moved toward the grand dining room, and with each step, Meg felt the weight of 5 years pressing against her determination like a physical force. Somewhere beyond those doors, William was waiting, her husband, who thought she was gone by choice, who had no idea about the daughter walking beside her, who had been kept ignorant through calculated cruelty of the life Lord Henry had destroyed. As Meg's hand touched the ornate handle of the dining room door, she paused for one last moment. In her mind, she travelled back to the beginning, to the spring of 1840, when everything had seemed possible, when love had felt like solid ground beneath her feet, rather than quicksand waiting to swallow her whole. She needed to remember how it had started, needed to hold on to the truth of what they had shared before cruelty twisted everything into lies. Because in just moments, she would face the man she had loved and lost, and she needed to remember who they had been before his father destroyed it all. 5 years earlier, Margaret Ashford had married William Thornfield in the spring of 1840, and for 2 years she had known happiness so complete it seemed too fragile to be real. William was everything she had been told dukes were not: kind, attentive, genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions, rather than simply requiring an ornamental wife to grace his table and provide heirs. They had met at a small country assembly, where Meg had been visiting her sister, and William had asked her to dance with none of the hauteur one expected from a duke, but with genuine interest in the conversation they'd begun about agricultural reform. 3 months of courtship had followed, walks in gardens, discussions that lasted hours, letters that revealed depths of character Meg had not anticipated finding in aristocratic circles. When he proposed, kneeling in her father's modest drawing room with a ring that had belonged to his mother, Meg had said yes with full heart and no hesitation. The wedding had been beautiful, the honeymoon blissful, and the first 2 years of marriage had been marked by growing affection that deepened into genuine love. But there had been one shadow over their happiness: Lord Henry Thornfield, William's father, and the Dowager Duke, who had never fully relinquished control of the dukedom to his son. He had opposed the marriage from the beginning, making clear his opinion that Meg's family was too modest, her dowry too small, her connections too limited to make her suitable as Duchess of Ravenworth. She is adequate for a country gentleman, Lord Henry had said within Meg's hearing at the wedding breakfast, but hardly worthy of the Thornfield name. Still, William is young and romantic. He'll learn the value of proper alliances eventually. Oh, Meg had tried to win him over through patience and respect, managing his household with competence, treating his tenants with kindness, supporting William's political work without complaint. But Lord Henry's disapproval had only hardened into active hostility, and the tension had grown worse when 2 years of marriage produced no heir. Then, in September of 1842, William had been summoned to represent England in delicate diplomatic negotiations in Vienna, work that would require months of careful attention and could not be delegated. He had been reluctant to leave, holding Meg close the night before his departure. "I don't want to go," he had murmured against her hair. 6 months is too long to be separated from you. It's your duty, Meg had replied, though her heart ached at the prospect of his absence. And I'll write to you every day. Time will pass quickly. Promise me you'll take care of yourself, William had said, pulling back to look at her seriously. My father can be difficult when I'm not here to buffer his moods. If he troubles you, write to me immediately and I'll return regardless of diplomatic consequence. I can manage your father, Meg had assured him with more confidence than she felt. I'm not as fragile as he seems to think. William had kissed her tenderly, and the next morning he had departed for Vienna, leaving Meg to manage Ravensworth Hall under the watchful, critical eye of Lord Henry Thornfield. For the first month, things had proceeded tolerably well. Meg had written to William daily as promised, receiving weekly letters in return that spoke of tedious negotiations and his eagerness to return home. She had managed the household, visited tenants, and maintained polite distance from Lord Henry, whose presence in the house felt increasingly oppressive without William there to moderate his behaviour. Then the letters from William had stopped arriving. Meg had told herself there were reasonable explanations. Correspondence could be delayed in international travel. Diplomatic work might have intensified and left him less time for personal letters. But as weeks passed without word, anxiety had begun gnawing at her carefully maintained composure. She had written to him, expressing concern, asking if he was well, begging for any word that would ease her worry. No response came, and then, on a cold November morning, Lord Henry had summoned her to the library with a formality that had made her stomach clench with foreboding. Mrs. Thornfield, he had said, using the diminished form of address he preferred over acknowledging her as Duchess. Sit down. There is a matter we must discuss regarding your position in this household. Meg had settled into the indicated chair with heart racing, watching as Lord Henry positioned himself behind the massive desk that had been William's workspace, claiming authority through physical positioning. Has something happened to William? She had asked, voice tight with sudden fear. Is he injured? The Duke is perfectly well, Lord Henry had replied with dismissive coldness. However, he has written to inform me of certain decisions regarding his marriage that you should be made aware of. He had withdrawn a letter from the desk drawer and slid it across the polished surface toward her. Meg had recognized William's handwriting immediately, the distinctive slant of his script, the bold strokes that she had memorized from dozens of love letters. With trembling hands, she had picked up the paper and begun to read. Father, I write to inform you of a decision I have reached after considerable reflection during my time in Vienna. My marriage to Margaret has proven to be a mistake born of youthful romanticism rather than mature judgment. She is a kind woman, and I bear her no ill will, but she lacks the sophistication and connections necessary for a Duchess of Ravenworth. Moreover, after 2 years without producing an heir, I must conclude that she is either unable to fulfill this fundamental duty or unwilling to do so. I therefore request that you manage the dissolution of this marriage in whatever manner you deem appropriate. I will not be returning to Ravensworth when my diplomatic work concludes, but will instead travel to our estate in Cornwall to consider my future. Please ensure that Mrs. Thornfield is provided with adequate settlement and removed from Ravenworth Hall with all necessary discretion to avoid unnecessary scandal. I trust you will handle this matter with your usual efficiency. William. The words had struck her like physical blows, each sentence driving the breath from her lungs and the strength from her limbs. Meg had read the letter 3 times, searching desperately for some indication that this was a cruel jest or terrible misunderstanding. But William's handwriting was unmistakable, his signature clear, the seal authentic. I don't understand, she whispered finally. This cannot be real. William would never. He loves me. We were happy. Just a month ago his letters spoke of missing me, of counting days until his return. The Duke's letters to you ceased several weeks ago, did they not? Lord Henry had interrupted smoothly. I suspect he found it easier to simply stop writing than to continue the pretense of affection he no longer felt. "No," Meg had said, rising from her chair with legs that barely supported her weight. "This is wrong. There must be some explanation. I need to write to William, to ask him directly." The Duke was quite clear in his letter, Lord Henry had said with finality. "He does not wish to correspond with you further. He has asked me to handle the dissolution, and I intend to do exactly that with the efficiency he requests." He had stood, moving around the desk with measured steps that suggested this interview was proceeding exactly as he had planned. "I have taken the liberty of having your personal belongings packed. A carriage is waiting to convey you to the coaching inn in the village, from which you may arrange transportation to your family or wherever you choose to establish yourself. I have prepared a bank draft for £200, which represents an extremely generous settlement given the brevity of your marriage and your failure to produce an heir." Meg had stared at him, comprehension dawning slowly through the shock that made thinking feel like wading through deep water. "You're sending me away. Now. Today." The Duke was clear about his desire for discretion, Lord Henry had replied. "A swift, quiet departure serves everyone's interests. Prolonging your residence here would only invite speculation and gossip that would damage the Thornfield name. I want to speak with William," Meg had managed, desperation sharpening her voice. "Before I agree to anything, I must hear this from him directly." "The Duke is in Vienna managing delicate diplomatic negotiations," Lord Henry had interrupted. "He cannot be disturbed for personal matters, and he has already made his wishes abundantly clear in writing. You may accept his decision with dignity, Mrs. Thornfield, or you may force me to take less pleasant measures to ensure your departure. The choice is yours." Meg had looked at him, at his cold eyes, his satisfied expression, his complete absence of sympathy or kindness, and she had understood with sudden terrible clarity that he had orchestrated this entire situation. The stopped letters, William's supposed change of heart, the convenient timing of this confrontation, while William was thousands of miles away and unable to confirm or deny the contents of that devastating letter. But what could she do? She had no proof of manipulation, no way to reach William in Vienna, no resources to resist a man with Lord Henry's power and determination. And the letter bore William's signature, used phrases that sounded like his voice, and demonstrated handwriting she could not claim to be forged. "I would like to speak with Mr. Winters," she had said finally, grasping for any witness who might provide protection or corroboration. Surely the butler should be informed of such significant changes to the household. "Winters is aware of the situation and has been instructed accordingly," Lord Henry had replied. "Now, Mrs. Thornfield, the carriage is waiting. I suggest you compose yourself and depart with whatever dignity you can muster, rather than forcing me to have you escorted from the premises." The threat had been delivered with perfect calm, but Meg had heard the steel beneath the courtesy. If she resisted, Lord Henry would have servants physically remove her, turning private humiliation into public spectacle. And still she had no proof, no evidence beyond her own conviction that William would never write such a letter, that their love had been real and enduring. "May I at least say goodbye to the staff?" she had asked, pride forcing her voice steady, even as her world collapsed around her. "To the tenants I've worked with these past 2 years. Unnecessary and inappropriate," Lord Henry had written. "Clean breaks serve everyone best. The carriage leaves in 15 minutes, Mrs. Thornfield. I suggest you use that time to collect yourself, rather than attempting futile delays." He had left the library then, closing the door behind him with quiet finality, and Meg had sunk back into the chair as the full weight of her situation crashed over her, cast out from her home, separated from her husband, with only £200 and whatever belongings Lord Henry had deemed appropriate to pack for her. She had stumbled to the window, looking out at the gardens she had tended, the stable where she had learned to ride with William's patient instruction, the paths they had walked together planning futures that now seemed cruelly fictional. and for the first time she had allowed the tears to come, hot and bitter, mourning not just her marriage, but the man she had thought William was, the man who apparently had never truly existed. 15 minutes later she had been in the carriage, trunk secured, £200 in her reticule, and the iron gates of Ravenworth Hall closing behind her with the finality of a tomb sealing shut. She had not known then that she carried William's daughter, that the nausea she attributed to grief was actually the first stirrings of pregnancy, that Lord Henry had separated not just husband from wife, but father from unborn child. She had learned that truth 3 weeks later in Edinburgh, alone in rented rooms with only her sister's letters connecting her to the life she had lost, and she had wept for the daughter who would grow up without knowing her father, without the position and security that should have been her birthright. But grief had transformed over the months of her pregnancy into determination, and determination had carried her through 5 years of poverty, isolation, and survival. Now she was back, and Lord Henry Thornfield was about to discover that the woman he had dismissed so easily had grown strong enough to demand the justice he had denied. The dining room of Ravenworth Hall fell silent as Meg pushed through the doors with Thea at her side and Eleanor just behind them. 50 faces turned toward the interruption, expressions shifting from irritation through confusion to shock as recognition slowly dawned. William saw her first. He had been raising a wine glass to his lips when the doors opened, and Meg watched the glass slip from his fingers, shattering against the table in an explosion of crystal and burgundy liquid that splattered across pristine white linens. His face drained of all colour, grey eyes widening with an emotion Meg couldn't name. Shock, certainly, but layered beneath it something that looked almost like desperate hope. "Meg!" Her name emerged as barely more than breath. "Margaret." Lord Henry Thornfield sat at the head of the table, and Meg watched his expression transform from confusion to fury, to something approaching fear as he registered not just Meg's presence, but the small figure holding her hand, his gaze fixed on Thea with the kind of desperate intensity that comes from recognizing disaster unfolding in real time. "What is the meaning of this?" Lord Henry demanded, his voice cutting through the shocked silence. "How dare you force your way into this dinner?" "I am the Duchess of Ravenworth," Meg interrupted, her voice carrying clearly through the room with authority she had learned in 5 years of fighting for survival. "I have every right to be in this house, at this table, among these guests who have gathered to celebrate with the family I was forcibly separated from through deliberate cruelty and calculated deception." Gasps rippled through the assembled aristocracy. Lady Pemberton clutched her pearls. Lord Ashford leaned forward with avid interest. The Countess of Marlborough whispered urgently to her neighbour behind a fan that did nothing to muffle the sound. William had risen from his seat, swaying slightly as if the floor had become unstable beneath him. "You left," he said, voice rough with emotion. Meg couldn't pass. "5 years ago, you left and I searched everywhere. I wrote to your family. I hired investigators. I left because your father presented me with a letter bearing your signature," Meg cut in, each word sharp and precise. "A letter stating that our marriage was a mistake, that I lacked the sophistication necessary for a duchess, that you wanted me removed from Ravensworth Hall, with all necessary discretion to avoid unnecessary scandal." William's face went from white to grey. "What letter? I never wrote. I would never—" "Lies," Lord Henry snarled, slamming his hand against the table hard enough to rattle crystal. "The woman abandoned you while you were serving England in Vienna. She disappeared without trace or explanation, leaving you to bear the humiliation of her desertion. I disappeared because I was cast out." Meg's voice rose. 5 years of suppressed fury finally finding release. "I disappeared because your father handed me a forged letter, supposedly written in your hand, gave me £200 and 15 minutes to leave the only home I had known as your wife, and threatened to have me physically removed if I resisted. The dining room erupted in scandalized murmurs. Several ladies produced smelling salts. Gentlemen exchanged significant looks that promised this story would circulate through every club in London within days. "This is absurd," Lord Henry said, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. "Why would I do such a thing? What possible motive?" "Because you never wanted me here," Meg replied with deadly calm. "Because you considered me beneath the Thornfield name, inadequate for your son, unworthy of the position I held. Because 2 years without an heir gave you the perfect excuse to remove the obstacle to a more advantageous alliance you had always preferred." She stepped forward, drawing Thea with her, and watched Lord Henry's face as the full implication registered. "But you made one critical miscalculation in your planning, my lord. You cast me out 3 weeks before I would have known I was carrying your son's child. You separated William from his daughter without his knowledge or consent, and you condemned your granddaughter to 5 years of poverty and exile because of your pride and prejudice." William made a sound like a wounded animal, his eyes fixed on Thea with dawning comprehension that transformed his expression from shock to something approaching devastation. "A daughter?" The words emerged strangled. "We have a daughter." Thea, who had been remarkably brave through the entire confrontation, now shrank back against Meg's skirts, as dozens of strange eyes fixed on her with fascination. Meg felt protective fury surge through her, and she placed both hands on her daughter's shoulders. "This is Thomas. We call her Thea," Meg said firmly. "She is 5 years old as of last month. She was born in Scotland, where I fled after your father cast me out. Raised in poverty, while you remained ignorant of her existence, denied her birthright and her father through calculated cruelty that began with a forged letter and continued through 5 years of deliberate silence." "Preposterous," Lord Henry blustered, but sweat had appeared on his forehead. "You cannot prove any of these wild accusations." "Can I not?" Meg turned her attention to the silent figure standing rigid near the sideboard. "Mr. Winters, you were present when Lord Henry presented me with that letter 5 years ago. You watched as I was ordered to leave Ravenworth Hall with only the belongings his lordship deemed appropriate to pack for me. You stood silent while I pleaded for explanation, for time to contact my husband, for any consideration beyond immediate expulsion. Tell everyone here, was I lying, or was I cast out exactly as I have described?" Mr. Winters, who had maintained perfect butler's composure for 30 years in Thornfield's service, looked between Meg and Lord Henry with an expression that suggested 30 years of suppressed guilt were finally overwhelming his professional discretion. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the back of a chair. "Answer the question, Winters," William commanded, his voice carrying ducal authority Meg had rarely heard him employ. "Did my father present my wife with a letter claiming to be written by me? Did he order her from this house?" The butler's face crumpled. "Yes, Your Grace," he whispered. "Everything she has said is true. Lord Henry summoned her to the library, presented her with a letter bearing your seal and signature, and gave her 15 minutes to leave the premises. When she asked to contact you directly, he refused. When she requested time to arrange proper departure, he threatened to have footmen escort her out forcibly." The dining room exploded in shocked exclamations. Several guests rose from their seats. Lady Ashford demanded smelling salts. Lord Pemberton called the situation an unprecedented scandal. William swayed again, and his brother James, who had been sitting beside him in stunned silence, caught his arm to steady him. "Dear God," William breathed. "You stood there and let him do it? You watched my wife being cast out from her home and said nothing." "I am sorry, Your Grace," Winters said, tears now streaming down his aged face. "I have carried the guilt every day since, but Lord Henry assured me you had authorized the action, that the letter was genuine, that I was simply following your wishes as conveyed through your father." "The letter was a forgery," William's voice cracked with anguish. I never wrote such words. I never wanted Meg gone. I loved... He broke off, seeming to register for the first time that he was proclaiming private emotions before 50 witnesses. I searched for you, he said to Meg directly. For months, I searched. Your family claimed ignorance of your location. No one had any information. I thought perhaps you had left of your own choice, that I had failed you somehow and driven you away. You failed me by trusting your father, Meg said quietly, and the words landed with more impact than shouting would have achieved. You failed me by not questioning why my letters stopped arriving, by not recognizing that the man who opposed our marriage from the beginning might have reason to engineer its destruction. William flinched as if struck, but he didn't look away from her. You're right, he said simply. I failed you in the worst possible way. I let my father control correspondence, believing his assurances that he would pass your letters to me in Vienna. I accepted his explanation when your letters stopped, thinking perhaps diplomatic complications were delaying mail. I was a fool and a failure as a husband. And my daughter, his voice broke as he looked at Thea. My daughter paid the price for my blindness. Lord Henry, who had been growing progressively paler throughout these revelations, suddenly pushed back from the table. This is a ridiculous theatre designed to extract money through false claims and manufactured scandals. The woman disappeared for 5 years and returns with some child she claims is William's without any proof. I am proof, Eleanor spoke up, her voice ringing clearly through the room. I visited my sister in Scotland multiple times over the past 5 years. I witnessed her poverty, her struggle to provide for a child she was raising alone, the sacrifices she made every day to ensure her daughter had food and shelter. And I saw the letters she wrote to William that were never sent because she had been deliberately led to believe that he had rejected her and wanted nothing more to do with her. She stepped forward, positioning herself beside Meg in a show of solidarity that made Meg's throat tighten with gratitude. Furthermore, anyone with eyes can see that child bears unmistakable resemblance to the Duke. The same grey eyes, the same chin, the same expression. Deny your granddaughter all you wish, Lord, but the truth is standing before you in the form of a 5-year-old girl who deserves better than your continued cruelty. James Thornfield, who had been watching Eleanor with an intensity that suggested he was seeing her properly for the first time, added his voice to the growing chorus against his father. Meg never showed any indication of discontent during her 2 years at Ravenworth. She was devoted to William, managed the household competently, treated tenants and servants with kindness that won genuine affection. Her disappearance made no sense at the time, and only father's insistence that she had left by choice prevented William from pursuing a more aggressive investigation. He turned to face Lord Henry with an expression that combined disappointment and dawning anger. What else have you manipulated, father? What other correspondences have you intercepted or altered to maintain control over William's life and decisions? Lord Henry's face had gone from pale to mottled red. I will not stand here and be accused by my own family. Then sit down and be accused, William interrupted with cold fury that made several guests draw sharp breaths. Or better yet, leave. Get out of this dining room, out of this house, and out of my sight before I forget that you're my father and have you thrown out the way you had my pregnant wife thrown out 5 years ago. The room fell silent. For perhaps 30 seconds, Lord Henry stood frozen, seeming to calculate whether he could salvage the situation through continued bluster or strategic retreat. Then, apparently recognizing that the battle was thoroughly lost, he turned and walked from the dining room with as much dignity as a man being expelled from his own son's house could muster. The doors closed behind him with quiet finality, and in the silence that followed, Meg heard Thea whisper, "Mama, I don't like that man." Despite everything, the tension, the revelation, the 50 aristocrats watching avidly. Meg felt a laugh escape. It was slightly hysterical, edged with tears and exhaustion, but genuine. "Neither do I, darling," she said. "Neither do I." William took a tentative step toward, then stopped, as if uncertain of his welcome. "Meg," he said quietly, could I speak with you, and with our daughter? Please." Meg looked at him, at the man she had loved and lost and mourned and resented in equal measure over 5 years of forced separation. He looked older than she remembered, lines of strain around his eyes, suggesting those 5 years had not been kind to him either. But beneath the changes she still recognized the William she had married, and in his expression she saw not the rejection she had been forced to believe, but genuine anguish at what had been stolen from them both. "Yes," she said finally, "but not here, not with an audience." William nodded quickly, relief flooding his features. He turned to address his guests with admirable composure given the circumstances. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption to your evening. However, I'm sure you understand that I have rather urgent family matters to address. Winters, please ensure our guests are well cared for. James, if you would act as host in my absence." "Of course," James said, though his attention seemed primarily focused on Eleanor. "Take all the time you need." William moved toward the door, then paused and turned back to Meg. "The blue drawing room," he suggested. "It was always your favorite." That he remembered such small details even after 5 years struck Meg with unexpected force. "The blue drawing room," she agreed. As they walked through Ravenworth Hall's familiar corridors, Meg, Thea, Eleanor and William maintaining careful distance, Meg felt the weight of 5 years pressing against the fragile hope trying to take root, despite her determined protection against further hurt. She had survived his father's cruelty and 5 years of exile, but surviving what came next, the explanations, the reckoning, the question of whether marriage could be rebuilt after such destruction, might prove far more difficult than anything she had endured in Scotland. Thea squeezed her hand, and Meg looked down to find her daughter watching her with solemn concern. "It's going to be all right, Mama," Thea whispered, with the certainty of childhood. "He seems nice." Meg blinked back tears and managed a smile. "We'll see, darling," she said. "We'll see." The blue drawing room was exactly as Meg remembered. Pale silk walls, delicate furniture that had always seemed too fine for comfortable use, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the gardens she had loved. William closed the door quietly behind them, then seemed at a loss for what to do or say next, standing awkwardly in the center of the room while Meg settled onto a sofa with Thea pressed close against her side. Eleanor positioned herself in a chair nearby, her presence making clear she had no intention of leaving Meg undefended. William noticed and nodded with what looked like approval. "Thank you for staying, Eleanor," he said quietly. "I'm glad Meg has family support. She should never have been left alone to face what my father inflicted." "No, she shouldn't have," Eleanor agreed, her tone suggesting she would reserve final judgment about William's role in that abandonment until hearing his explanation. William's attention shifted to Thea, and Meg watched emotions chase across his face too quickly to name. Wonder, regret, longing, grief for lost years. "May I?" He swallowed hard. "May I speak to her? I don't want to frighten her, but I would very much like to know my daughter." Meg looked down at Thea, who was watching William with the careful assessment children employ when determining if adults are safe. "What do you think, darling? Would you like to talk with your papa?" Thea considered for a long moment, then gave a small nod. William crossed the room slowly and knelt before the sofa, bringing himself to her eye level with instinctive understanding of how to approach frightened children. "Hello, Thea," he said gently. "I'm very happy to meet you, though I wish I had known about you years ago. Your mama is right. I had no idea you existed, but if I had known, nothing in the world could have kept me from being there for you both." "Mama said you were far away," Thea observed. "I was," William agreed. First in Vienna because England needed me for diplomatic work, and then later in Cornwall because I was sad and confused about why your mama had left. But I was never far away in my heart, Thea. I thought about your mama every day and wished I could find her and bring her home. We lived in Scotland, Thea offered, in a little cottage with a garden where Mama grew vegetables. Pain flashed across William's face. You lived in a cottage while Ravenworth Hall stood mostly empty, he said quietly. That was wrong, deeply wrong. You should have been here, in this house, with servants to care for you, and gardens to play in, and everything a duke's daughter deserves. I liked our cottage, Thea said with the loyalty of childhood, and Mama told me stories every night about knights and quests, and brave people doing hard things. William's eyes found Meg's. Your Mama is the bravest person I know, he said. She survived something terrible and raised you alone, and I suspect every story she told you was true, because she has been on her own quest for justice and truth. Meg felt tears threatening and blinked them back firmly. This was not the time to break down, not with Thea watching and decisions still unmade about what came next. Thea, Eleanor said gently, why don't you come with me to find Mrs. Carson in the kitchen? I believe she keeps gingerbread for special occasions, and meeting your papa for the first time certainly qualifies. Thea looked to Meg for permission, and Meg nodded despite reluctance to be separated from the child who had been her only anchor through 5 years of isolation. Go with Aunt Eleanor, darling. I'll be right here when you return. Once Eleanor and Thea had departed, silence settled heavy between Meg and William. He remained kneeling where Thea had left him, as if his legs had forgotten how to support his weight, and Meg sat rigid on the sofa trying to organize 5 years of grief and fury into coherent communication. I loved you, William said finally, the words emerging rough and raw. I loved you so much it terrified me sometimes. When I left for Vienna, I counted days until I could return to you. Every negotiation felt like an obstacle keeping me from what actually mattered. And then your letters stopped arriving and my father told me. He broke off, voice cracking, and buried his face in his hands for a moment before continuing. He told me you had written to say the marriage wasn't working, that you needed space to think, that you were visiting family and would write when you had clarity about our future. I didn't believe him at first. I wrote to you demanding an explanation, pleading for you to tell me what I had done wrong, but the letters came back undeliverable or received no response. And eventually my father showed me one he claimed had arrived in your hand saying you wanted freedom from marriage that had become suffocating. Let me guess, Meg said bitterly. That letter bore my signature and used phrases that sounded like my voice. William nodded miserably. I still didn't want to believe it, but you were gone when I returned from Vienna. Your family claimed ignorance about your location, and no amount of investigation produced any trace of where you had gone. My father insisted you had left of your own choice, that continuing to search would only embarrass us both. Eventually, He stopped, shame written clearly across his features. Eventually, I let myself believe it. It was easier than accepting that I had failed you so completely that you had fled rather than remain my wife. You did fail me, Meg said, the words hard but necessary, not by being unworthy or inadequate, but by trusting your father when you should have questioned his convenient narrative, by not recognizing that the man who opposed our marriage might have reason to destroy it. I know, William said simply. I have had 5 years to recognize my failure, Meg, and the recognition does not become less painful with time. I was a fool and a coward, and my weakness allowed my father to separate us and condemn you to poverty and exile. I cannot begin to imagine. He raised his eyes to meet hers, and Meg saw genuine anguish there, alongside something that looked like desperate hope. But I never stopped loving you, even when I believed you had left by choice, even when I tried to convince myself I should forget you and consider remarriage for duty. I could not let you go. You were always there in every decision I made, Every moment of loneliness, every time I walked through Ravenworth's empty rooms, remembering when they had felt like home because you were in them. Meg wanted to resist the words, to maintain the protective anger that had sustained her through years of abandonment, but beneath the fury she could feel something else stirring, recognition of shared grief, acknowledgement that William had been as much a victim of his father's cruelty as she had been, and the traitorous persistence of love that 5 years and deliberate betrayal had not entirely killed. "I don't know if I can forgive," she said honestly. "Not your father, certainly. He deserves no mercy for what he did. But you, William, I loved you desperately, trusted you completely, and when that letter destroyed everything, I never questioned whether you might have been manipulated. I simply believed you had rejected me, and I tried to survive the destruction." "As you should have," William said with immediate fervour. "You owed me nothing after being cast out. That you survived, that you raised our daughter alone, that you came back to demand justice. Meg, that takes courage I'm not sure I possess. I admire you even as I grieve everything that was stolen from us." He shifted from kneeling to sitting on the floor, as if the weight had finally become too much to bear in any more formal position. "What can I do?" he asked quietly. "How can I possibly make amends for 5 years of poverty and exile and abandonment? I cannot give you back the time that was stolen. I cannot undo the hardship you endured. But I will spend the rest of my life trying to provide whatever justice or restitution is possible if you will tell me what you need." Meg drew a shaking breath. "I need you to acknowledge Thea publicly as your legitimate daughter and heir. I need you to ensure she has all the security and position that should have been hers from birth. I need—" her voice caught. "I need to know that she will never face the poverty and uncertainty I endured, that regardless of what happens between you and me, she will always be protected and provided for always." "Done," William said immediately. "I will have the solicitors draft papers immediately recognizing Thea as my legitimate daughter and heir. She will have trust funds, property in her own name, every legal protection I can devise. And Meg," he hesitated, "you will have the same. Regardless of whether you choose to remain my wife or seek annulment, you will be provided lavishly as compensation for what my father inflicted and what I failed to prevent." "I don't want your money," Meg said, but without heat. "I want—" She stopped, uncertain how to articulate what she actually wanted beyond financial security for Thea. Justice against Lord Henry, certainly, acknowledgement of the wrongs inflicted. But beneath those concrete demands, she could feel something more fragile and dangerous, the desire for what she had lost, for the marriage and partnership and love that had made 2 years at Ravensworth feel like home before cruelty destroyed everything. "What do you want, Meg?" William asked gently. "Tell me, and if it's in my power, I will move heaven and earth to provide it." "I want to not be afraid," Meg whispered. "I want to trust again. I want Thea to have her father, and I want to believe that love is real and enduring, rather than something that disappears the moment it becomes inconvenient." William rose slowly and crossed to sit beside her on the sofa, maintaining careful distance but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "I cannot promise you will never be afraid," he said quietly. "Fear is a rational response to having been betrayed and abandoned. But I can promise that I will never again trust my father's word over yours, that I will question everything and everyone before accepting comfortable lies, that I will fight to protect you and Thea with everything I have." He reached out tentatively, and when Meg didn't pull away, he took her hand in both of his, with a gentleness that made her throat tighten. "And I can promise that my love was real, is real, and will continue to be real, regardless of whether you can find it in yourself to forgive and try again. You owe me nothing, Meg, but I owe you everything, and I will spend however long it takes proving that you and Thea are my first priority in all things." Meg looked at their joined hands and remembered other times he had held her this way. During their courtship, on their wedding day, on quiet evenings when they had sat together planning futures that had seemed so certain. The memory hurt, but it also reminded her that the love between them had been genuine before cruelty intervened. "I cannot go back to who I was," she said finally. "That trusting, naive girl your father cast out is gone. I am harder now, more suspicious, less willing to accept assurances without proof." "Good," William said firmly. "That hardness kept you and Thea alive. It enabled you to come back and demand justice. I don't want you to return to who you were, Meg. I want to know who you've become and build something new with the woman you are now, rather than attempting to recreate what we lost." He squeezed her hand gently. "Will you stay? Not forever if you're not ready for that commitment, but for now. Give me time to prove my word is trustworthy, to show Thea what having a father means, to demonstrate that Ravenworth can be home again rather than a source of pain." Meg wanted to say no, to protect herself and Thea from the risk of further hurt, but she could feel the exhaustion of 5 years carrying everything alone, the weight of decisions and fears and responsibilities that had never been meant for one person to bear in isolation. And beneath the protective layers she had built, some stubborn part of her heart still recognized William as its match, still wanting the partnership they had begun building before his father's cruelty destroyed everything. "I'll stay," she said finally. "But William, if you or your father or anyone in this house hurts Thea or makes her feel unwelcome or less than she deserves, I will leave and you will never see either of us again. She is my first priority above everything else." "As she should be," William agreed immediately. "And if I fail in my duty to protect and cherish her, you would be right to leave, and I would accept it as just a consequence of my failure." The door opened, and Eleanor returned with Thea, whose face bore evidence of gingerbread consumption and whose eyes were bright with the resilience of childhood. "Mamma, Mrs. Carson remembered me from before. Well, not me exactly, but she said she always hoped you would have a baby, and now I'm here." Meg pulled Thea into her arms, breathing in the familiar scent of her daughter and drawing strength from the solid reality of the child she had fought so hard to protect. "Mrs. Carson is very wise," she said, "and she's right. You were hoped for and wanted, even before anyone knew you existed." William watched them with an expression of such profound longing that Eleanor touched his arm gently. "It will take time," she said quietly, "but time is something you now have, if you use it wisely." "I intend to," William replied, his eyes never leaving Meg and Thea. Starting now, over the following weeks, as Christmas approached and then passed into the new year of 1848, a careful dance of rebuilding began at Ravenworth Hall. William kept his word about public acknowledgement. Notices appeared in every major newspaper declaring Thea as his legitimate daughter and heir. Solicitors prepared trusts and property transfers, and society's inevitable gossip was met with such firm, aristocratic backing that those who might have whispered scandal found themselves ostracized instead. Lord Henry Thornfield, meanwhile, discovered that 5 years of manipulating correspondence and controlling his son's life had left him vulnerable to investigation he could not withstand. William's examination of estate accounts revealed systematic embezzlement dating back a decade, money siphoned from tenant rents, falsified expense reports, investments made with ducal funds, but profits directed to personal accounts. The amounts totaled nearly £30,000, a sum so staggering that even Lord Henry's most loyal allies could not defend him. Rather than face public trial and imprisonment, Lord Henry accepted exile to a remote estate in northern Scotland, with annual income barely sufficient to maintain genteel poverty. His social position collapsed overnight, former friends refusing to acknowledge him, clubs revoking membership, business partners severing connections. He departed Ravensworth in January with one small trunk and the recognition that he had destroyed far more than a marriage through his cruelty. He had lost everything he valued while achieving nothing but his own ruin. For Meg, the weeks of rebuilding were marked by small gestures that accumulated into gradual. William had flowers delivered to her rooms daily, not grand bouquets, but small arrangements of her favourite blooms that he somehow remembered from years ago. He spent hours with Thea, learning her preferences and habits and stories, proving through consistent attention that fatherhood was not a burden to be endured, but joy he had been denied. And he courted Meg again, carefully and patiently, as if recognizing that trust shattered required more delicate reconstruction than trust merely dented. He asked permission before entering rooms, respected her stated boundaries about separate chambers, never presumed affection was owed, but rather something to be earned through demonstrated reliability. "You don't have to bring me gifts," Meg told him one afternoon in late January, when he presented her with a first edition of a book she had mentioned loving years ago. "I agreed to stay and try to rebuild. You don't need to purchase my cooperation." "I know," William said simply, "but I want you to have things that bring you joy, Meg. For 5 years, you had nothing but survival and responsibility. You deserve beauty and comfort and evidence that you are valued not for what you provide, but simply because you exist and you matter." The words struck deeper than expensive gifts could manage, and Meg felt the protective walls she had built beginning to develop cracks that let warmth through despite her caution. Eleanor, meanwhile, had developed her own careful dance with James Thornfield, William's younger brother, who had supported Meg's revelations and stood firmly against his father's cruelty. They could often be found in quiet conversation in the library or walking Ravenworth's extensive grounds, and while neither spoke openly about courtship, the growing affection between them was obvious to anyone who cared to notice. "Your sister seems happy," William observed one evening as he and Meg sat in the blue drawing room while Thea slept upstairs. "James is a good man despite our father's influence. I think they would be well suited if Eleanor can forgive the Thornfield name for what our father inflicted." "She's stronger than I am in some ways," Meg said, "more willing to separate individuals from family guilt. I still struggle to be in this house sometimes, without remembering the day Lord Henry cast me out." William set aside the book he had been reading and turned to face her fully. "Then we'll leave," he said immediately. "The London house, the Cornwall estate, anywhere you feel safer and less haunted by difficult memories. Ravenworth is just a building, Meg. You and Thea are what matter." The casual way he offered to abandon the ducal seat, the assumption that her comfort outweighed tradition and expectation, struck Meg with force that finally broke through her remaining defences. "No," she said, "I don't want to. I want to take back what your father tried to say. I want Thea to grow up here knowing this is her home. And I want—" She stopped, the admission catching in her throat. William waited patiently, giving her space to find words for feeling she had been afraid to acknowledge. "I want to remember the good we had before your father destroyed it. The walks in the garden, the evenings reading together, the plans we made for the future. I want to create new memories that prove love is stronger than cruelty if we're willing to fight for it." William's eyes brightened with cautious hope. "Are we fighting for it, Meg? Are you saying you want to try to rebuild our marriage properly, rather than simply coexisting for Thea's sake?" "I'm saying I'm tired of being afraid," Meg replied. "I'm saying 5 years of surviving alone taught me strength I didn't know I possessed, but it also taught me that some things are worth risking hurt for. You have been patient and kind and consistent, William. You have demonstrated through action, rather than just words, that Thea and I are your priority. And I think," she drew a shaking breath, "I think perhaps love doesn't have to be a fragile thing that breaks under pressure. Perhaps it can be something we choose to build every day through effort and honesty and commitment." William closed the distance between them slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wished. When she didn't pull away, he cupped her face in his hands with gentleness that made tears gather, despite her determination to remain composed. "I love you," he said simply. I love the girl you were. I love the woman you've become. And I will love you every day for the rest of my life if you'll let me. Not because duty requires it, or because Thea needs her parents together, but because you are the match to my soul, and I have been incomplete without you. Meg closed her eyes, feeling tears slip free despite her best efforts. I love you too, she whispered. I tried not to, tried to protect myself by killing that love, but it refused to die. It just waited, stubborn and patient, for safety enough to breathe again. The kiss when it came was tender and tentative, nothing like the passionate embraces of their early marriage, but something perhaps more precious. The gentle rebuilding of intimacy that acknowledged hurt while choosing hope despite fear. William's arms came around her with care that suggested he was holding something infinitely precious and fragile, and Meg let herself lean into his strength while maintaining her own rather than surrendering everything as she had done in naive youth. When they finally parted, both were crying silently, mourning what had been lost while celebrating what might be built from ruins. We'll take it slowly, William said, still holding her close. However long you need to feel safe again, Meg. I'm not going anywhere. Neither am I, Meg replied. For the first time in 5 years, I'm not running or hiding or surviving day by day. I'm staying, and I'm choosing you and us and the family we can become. Margaret Thornfield stood at the window of Ravenworth Hall's nursery, watching snow fall gently over gardens that had become more beautiful than she remembered from her first years here. Below in the courtyard, William was building a snowman with Thea, who at 12 had grown into a poised young lady but still delighted in such childish pleasures when snow fell thick enough. Their laughter drifted up through the cold air, clear and joyful. A small hand tugged at Meg's skirt, and she looked down to find her son Robert, named for William's grandfather rather than his father to avoid confusion, gazing up at her with the serious grey eyes he had inherited from both parents. Mama, can I go help Papa with the snowman? In a moment, darling, Meg said, kneeling to adjust his scarf more securely. Let me make sure you're properly bundled first. You know how you get cold and then complain about frozen fingers. I won't complain, Robert promised with the earnestness of a 6-year-old who genuinely meant it in the moment. I'll be very brave like Thea says. Meg smiled and kissed his forehead. Very well. Go join your father and sister, but if you get too cold, you come inside immediately. Robert raced from the nursery with the boundless energy of childhood, and Meg watched from the window as William scooped him up and spun him in a circle before setting him down to help with snowman construction. The scene was so perfectly domestic, so far from the devastation of 7 years ago, that Meg sometimes still caught herself marvelling at how completely their lives had transformed. They make quite the picture, Eleanor said from the doorway, infant daughter sleeping peacefully in her arm. She had married James Thornfield 3 years ago in a wedding that had felt like a celebration of family healing as much as romantic union, and their daughter Catherine was 6 months old and already displaying her father's cheerful disposition. They do, Meg agreed. I sometimes have to remind myself that this is real and not some elaborate dream I'll wake from, to find myself still in that drafty Scottish cottage. Eleanor crossed to join her at the window. It's very real, sister. You fought for it, survived for it, and built it through courage that still amazes me. You deserve every bit of happiness you've found. Meg looked at the scene below, William and Thea and Robert, the estate she now managed with confidence rather than fear, the life she had reclaimed from cruelty and exile, and felt gratitude so profound it brought tears despite 7 years of practice holding them back. I never thought I could forgive, she said quietly. When I stood at those gates with Thea 5 years ago, I was so full of rage and hurt and determination to demand justice. I never imagined I would find my way back to love. William proved himself worthy of forgiveness, Eleanor observed. Not everyone would have done the work he did to rebuild trust. That was true. William had spent 7 years demonstrating through consistent action that his words matched his commitments, managing the estate with Meg's full partnership rather than treating her as ornament, prioritizing their children above social obligations, defending her against any whisper of criticism from society members who still occasionally suggested scandal around her return. He had proven reliable when reliability mattered most, and love had grown deeper for being tested and rebuilt, rather than accepted without challenge. The door opened, and William appeared, snow dusting his dark hair and his cheeks flushed with cold. "Thea wants you to come see the snowman," he announced. "Apparently, it's the finest snowman ever constructed and requires maternal admiration immediately." "Does it?" Meg asked with amusement. "And what do you think, Your Grace? Is it worthy of such grand praise?" "Absolutely," William said with mock seriousness. "I've seen snowmen across England and Europe, and I can state with ducal authority that ours is superior in every respect." Meg laughed, the sound coming easily now after 7 years of relearning joy. "Then I suppose I must come to admire this masterpiece before it melts." William helped her into her cloak with the same attentive care he showed in everything involving her comfort, and they descended together to the courtyard, where Thea and Robert waited with pride beside their creation. The snowman was indeed impressive, tall and properly proportioned, with a carrot nose and coal eyes, and one of William's old hats perched at a jaunty angle. "It's magnificent," Meg pronounced solemnly. "Truly the finest snowman I've ever seen." "I knew you'd think so," Thea said with satisfaction. "Papa said you would appreciate proper craftsmanship." Robert tugged at Meg's hand. "Can we make another one tomorrow? A whole snow family?" "If the snow lasts," Meg agreed, "we can make as many snow people as you like." William's arm came around her waist, drawing her close against the cold, and Meg leaned into his warmth with the easy trust of 7 years rebuilding what had been shattered. This was home, not the grand house, or the title, or the position, but the people who inhabited this space with her, the love they had fought to protect and nurture, the future they were building together one day at a time. "Happy?" William murmured against her hair, quiet enough that only she could hear. "Deliriously," Meg replied honestly. "Though 7 years ago, if someone had told me I would feel this way again, I would never have believed them." "7 years ago you were the bravest person in England," William said, "walking through those gates to demand justice when you had every reason to simply stay away and try to forget. You saved us, Meg. You saved our family by refusing to let cruelty have the final." Meg turned in his arms to look up at him properly. "We saved each other. You proved that love could be rebuilt if both people were willing to do. That's not salvation from one side, that's partnership." William kissed her forehead, and Thea made exaggerated gagging sounds that made Robert dissolve into giggles. "Mama and Papa are being mushy again," Thea announced with the dramatic suffering of a 12-year-old embarrassed by parental affection. "We certainly are," William agreed cheerfully. "And we're going to continue being mushy for many years to come, so you might as well become accustomed to it." As they returned to the warmth of Ravenworth Hall, Meg looked back once more at the snowman standing guard in the courtyard, and she thought about transformation, how things frozen and barren could become beautiful given time and care, how love could survive winter and bloom again in spring, how courage and truth could triumph over cruelty if held onto with stubborn determination. She had been cast out pregnant by a wicked father-in-law who had tried to erase her from his son's life. She had survived 5 years of poverty and exile, raising a daughter alone, while society believed her guilty of abandonment. She had returned with that daughter as living proof of the truth that had been buried, and she had fought for justice against a man who had considered her too insignificant to matter, and she had won. Not just the battle for recognition and restitution, but the deeper war for trust and partnership and love that endured beyond the damage cruelty inflicted. 7 years later, Standing in Ravenworth Hall, with her husband's arm around her waist and her children's laughter echoing through rooms that had witnessed both her destruction and her triumph, Margaret Thornfield knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Home. Not the place she'd been sent away from, but the life she had fought to reclaim and rebuild into something stronger than what had been taken. Home. Earned through courage rather than granted through privilege. Home. Built on truth rather than lies. Simply home.